Welcome, Johnny. Happy to have you with us.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Looking forward to this conversation.
Very good. So, the first question I've prepared for you is a hard one. I really want to go really deep into the question itself. What is the most unequal scene that you have seen? And why do you think it's unequal? So unequal that it calls out to you.
I started this project in a country that I wasn't born in. So to me, it was fairly easy to have eyes as an outsider starting this project. I was born in America and I traveled to South Africa when I was 30 years old to be a student at University of Cape Town. And the project started in Cape Town. The project started because I was interested in seeing what the post-apartheid landscape looked like from the air. And drones were a new technology that kind of allowed me to do that easily and cheaply. But I think when you ask what the real surprise was with this project and what the most unequal scene was, I have to say that going back to the United States, to me, didn't surprise me as much as saddened me because it reinforced the notion that this is a systemic issue across geographies and across global North and global South divides between rich and poor nations, developing nations and developed nations, and my home country versus my adopted country. When I went back to Seattle, which is where I spent a lot of my years growing up, where I went to high school, there were these, at the time, this is 2017 is when I went to Seattle to take the photos. There were these mini house communities that the city of Seattle had implemented around the city to try to address the homelessness crisis. And the homelessness crisis has only gotten worse in Seattle and a lot of West Coast cities. People probably know about San Francisco and Los Angeles, Skid Row, places like that. And I've also photographed those. But Seattle to me was like my home. And it was this very blatant representation of how resources were allocated in a country that prides itself on opportunity and dreams and fulfillment of desire and the ability to make individual choices. That to me was just like where the rubber hit the road in terms of like the failure of that kind of idea. And there's innovations in the United States that are made possible by that sort of philosophy and political and economic climate. But there's real drawbacks too. And so when I saw those little home communities, they were like the size of the shacks that I saw in Cape Town. I don't know in square feet, probably a couple hundred square feet. They were very tiny. They were like a cabin. And they put them into rows next to like busy roads and industrial estates, like not very nice places. And they had to move them every year. So that was part of the equation in the city of Seattle, was that you couldn't have a permanent community of small homes. You had to keep moving them because the residents didn't really accept it. And that's something perennially that I found in the United States, was that even though people see the problems with homelessness and crime and drug use and alcoholism and everything that comes with not supporting social services and providing enough housing, they still cling to this idea of the philosophy, the economic and political philosophy that enables it. And so I think there's like a disconnect there between what people actually want in their neighborhoods and what they vote for and what they think they want. And that in between is a really interesting state that I hope my photos in part kind of provoke conversations around.
So I was like asking you what was the most unequal scene that you saw, and you somehow returned back home. So was there some viscerality that you experienced about these, tiny home community that was so close to home that you had to mention that as the most unequal, in your initial days, I guess, of starting this project?
Yeah, I think that when I went home to take the photos for this project and I saw it across the United States, I saw this in Seattle, Oakland, Los Angeles, Baltimore, Detroit. And by saw that, I mean saw the homelessness crisis. I saw people living rough. I saw tiny home communities and sort of DIY solutions for these services outside of the remit of the state government and the federal government trying to solve the problem structurally. That to me, like, kind of brought the project into a personal project in a way that it hadn't been before. But then I also think my target audience has always been people who kind of look like me and from my own background. People sometimes ask me, they're like, do the poor people on the side of your photos, the disadvantaged people, What do they think about your project? Are they shocked? And I always tell them whenever I show my photos to the representative two sides, it's inevitably the more disadvantaged side that goes, yeah, we know. We've been living like this for a long time. And the more affluent side is always the ones that seem shocked. And so creating sort of like this holistic understanding of the systemic nature of inequality, to me, for my target audience, which is really the people that didn't know, the sort of richer people on the affluent side of my photos in that boundary, that to me was like a really strategic way of communicating to them. This is your city. This is a country that doesn't think that, I mean, I love America, I really do. But the language that sometimes people use, and especially the media uses when they refer to countries outside of the global north, let's call it third world, or Trump uses very much more disparaging language to these countries. To me, this was an opportunity to kind of put a finger in the eye of those narratives and say, this looks exactly the same from the air. You can't tell the difference between this tiny house community in Seattle and these shacks in Cape Town. And you can't tell me that there's something philosophically or morally superior about the way this country is set up, this economy is set up, when you see the evidence with your own eyes. And I think that relevance, speaking to that audience in that way and creating some sort of relevance that these photos matter to them, helped it succeed. It still helps it succeed. It's not a project about poverty. It's not a flyover of poverty in Africa or Asia or something like that elicits some sort of sympathy. I'm trying to really provoke some sort of complicity, this feeling that it's relevant for people where they're at.
There is something, having grown up in India, where various kinds of inequalities and differences are so all around and visible that they become invisible because it's everywhere. And when you spoke about the affluent communities that you address, them not seeing it, was the invisibility coming from the visibility, or they were completely ignorant?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because when the photos hit in Cape Town, when they went viral, people were writing on my Facebook page. They said, "I've never knew that inequality was this bad in South Africa." That to me was shocking. Because it was pretty in your face and nothing has changed, unfortunately. If you go back to Cape Town, you still see the shacks extending out for miles in either direction, and hundreds of thousands of people just in Cape Town living in really dire circumstances, while a tiny elite live in much more affluent European standard circumstances on the coast and near the mountain. So to me, like, driving in Cape Town every day past the trees and the walls and the fences that separated the rich from the poor. And there's some real clear boundaries that I have in my mind. And I tried to take photos of most of these boundaries. To me, was also a response to me starting to feel that way. I had lived in Cape Town in 2016. I had lived there for 4 years at that point, and I started to feel like I don't want to say a normal, wealthy South African, but someone who was just going about my day-to-day business and kind of trying to ignore the fact that on the other side of the street was people living in really rough circumstances, because that's kind of the only way to survive, and mentally the only way to sort of not break down. Also in India or in Kenya or in Brazil, I mean, any of these places where you really have dire inequality on the other side of the street, quite literally. I never want to say that like I'm passing judgment on people who are in the more affluent side of the city, because people don't get to choose where they're born. And if they decide to move to a place like that, there's a lot of things that you can do to alleviate the circumstances and the personal dynamics and the family dynamics of your community, and still ignore on your drive to work the fact that on the other side of the road, there's those shacks. So that was, kind of the reason why I wanted to see from a new perspective from the drone. And that was new technology at the time. 2015, 2016, it was pretty new in South Africa. And the fact of being able to look straight down, because the way that the drone takes photos, the gimbal on the camera, or the camera gimbal, actually can rotate straight down. And before that, people had taken aerial photos of Cape Town and many different places, and inequality is not something new. So there had been photos that had been taken before, but they'd all been taken by helicopters or airplanes. And it's almost impossible to look straight down. So you have to take it out of the window of the airplane or the helicopter. And this has been told to me by many photo editors, that looking straight down, there's like a power in that, basically, that the drone made possible. It was really only the drone that made that possible. Yeah.
So, I'm imagining myself in one of those tall buildings in Mumbai,
Yeah.
and looking, my view is Dharavi, the slums. I mean, it's in front of me, but in a certain way, I don't see myself. I'm not looking straight down, but I'm looking at an angle, so I myself might be invisible from the building. While, watching a drone, you see this gradation or this sharp curve in what is visually there. But from the building itself, it's not visible.
Yeah. I mean, I also initially wanted to focus on this space in between the two communities. I'm sitting in Berlin, and one of the interesting things about the Berlin Wall for me was not the wall itself, but this strip that was right next to it. I think it's called the kill strip or the death strip. It was about 50 meters wide. And that's where you had to kind of run across. So the Berlin Wall had this death strip that was like 50 meters wide, and it was empty, and it had floodlights pointed at it. So the people that were trying to cross the wall needed to run and then climb up the wall and over the other side. But there was a strip where they could shoot them, basically. And in Cape Town, I saw some of the divides basically looking like that. And so I wanted to put the divides in the center of my photographs. So the thing about the Berlin Wall was this death strip, and looking straight down at some of these divides in Cape Town, my interest was really the divide between the rich and the poor and the liminal space in between.
I would love to hear from you about that liminal space in between the rich and the poor. I think that is very interesting. What have you observed about the space, and have you felt it? What qualities do you see from the air?
The interesting thing about the liminal spaces is that sometimes they were just a fence wide, and sometimes they were a row of hedges, and sometimes they were quite wide, But to me, in Cape Town, having studied this in my anthropology courses, I realized that this was actually planned out by people. And I imagine like small, smoky rooms, a group of white people in South Africa deciding where people could live. And through my research and doing this project, that's exactly what happened. So people who were not white had to live in certain areas. People who were white got to live in other areas. And the infrastructure between them was really interesting. It was designed in such a way to keep people separate. Entrances, bridges, geographical features were all designed to keep people from not mingling. And so that to me was really interesting from an infrastructure perspective. And I've seen that replicated across different cities across the world as well. This sort of infrastructural divides, which are systemic and take a lot of resources to not only create, but to fix. And I think this is important because oftentimes in the inequality debate, let's call it, or the sort of news cycle, you hear people say things like, it's really like this self-driven separateness. People are just biologically different, or they're desiring to stay separate from each other rather than there's some sort of systemic nature keeping them apart. I hear that a lot. And there's even comments on my Facebook page to that effect. And my my response is always to look at these maps. Basically, my photos are kind of like maps, and actually count the entrances into the neighborhood on the other side of the street from the white neighborhood in Cape Town. I'm thinking of, for example, Pinelands and Langa, which is a designed community for white people, is actually designed around the idea of the English Garden City. And then Langa, which was a very historic and still is black township, they're only separated by a road, essentially, and a tiny creek. There's very few entrances. In fact, I don't know if there's any on the main axis between the two that connect them directly. You have to go out to the highway and then take another exit to get into Langa, even though they're just a stone's throw away. And in doing this project, I realized in India, in Kenya, in Brazil, it's very common. And so there's undeniably, in my opinion, and I see my photos really as collecting evidence. I see them as data collection as much as I see them as artworks. There's really undeniable data collection that shows that there's something at work here. It's not a conspiracy. It's architecture and it's design and it's a systemic choices that people have made. Unfortunately, and I'm American, Americans have sort of, and the Europeans have kind of pioneered this idea of keeping people separate because we were the first ones to kind of like organize our cities in that kind of a way. This idea of separateness, apartheid literally means separateness. And I hope my project inspires some sort of conversation around that, because it really does act like a map, but it's not a map, The fact that I took it as a photographer means something different to people. And so the difference between like a Google Maps view and this art project where a human photographer actually went out and researched these locations, took the photos, and then is speaking about it, that also means a lot to people, that there's a human in the loop, I've noticed. Yeah.
So, I mean, you spoke about your art, your photographs, eliciting or inviting conversation on this topic. And I'm wondering, has there been like a story of real transformation in one of the communities that has, been a result of your work or your photos exposing the inequalities?
Oh, that's a good question. I try to expose these inequalities primarily to show the systemic nature of how inequality works around the world. And there's a lot of attempts and great work being done by politicians, NGOs, governments, private sector workers, a lot of people, activists, a lot of people working to reduce those inequalities through a variety of means. And I've been kind of fortunate enough, I suppose, to be in a position where I'm able to serve these pieces of communication about what these things look like from the air and what they could represent on the ground. And unfortunately, I mean, a lot of things look the same. Thinking of in Cape Town, my image, the first image I ever photographed in Cape Town, has actually grown in size. The settlement there, Masupumalele, has grown. And you can actually see the approach, because I go back there almost every year and take another photo. It's the only place that I keep going back to, actually. So I've taken 8 or 9 photographs in Masupumalele now. And every year you can see this approach of the shacks really encroaching closer and closer to the electric fence of the rich community of Lake Michelle. And my idea always was like, what happens when it reaches the fence? Like this is kind of a slow motion disaster. It's right. You're like, you can't take your eyes away, because once it hits the fence, something's kind of got to give, right? Like either they have to fix the problem or they overrun. And there was a fire there a couple of years ago, and the city went in and put in new shacks that are much more organized and kind of retreated some of the developments, because of now they've got these like city built shacks. And in a way you could see that as progress. In a way you could see that the city is going in and attempting to sort of fix the problem of unmitigated sprawl of unregulated immigration into the Western Cape, specifically in this one township. In another way, you could see it as a real disaster, that the city is attempting to formalize an informal area and essentially encase those people in some sort of calcified skeleton of informality, give them an address, give them electricity, give them jobs or provide opportunities, but they don't get to move out of the space that they only moved to in the first place is because it was land that was available, not because it was desirable. And I'll tell you a quick anecdote that kind of sums that up. My photo of Johannesburg, which was on the cover of Time magazine, which is maybe one of the most famous photos that I've taken. It's from a place called Primrose in Macaus. And Macaus was this gold mine. And the gold mine finished operations, and the empty land there was taken over by people from a variety of places, most of them Black Africans. And on the other side, there's this community of Primrose, which is kind of nice suburban. And the photo is very stark, And that photo went on the cover of Time magazine with the title, "The World's Most Unequal Country." And I was kind of, I have to say, like, I was happy that the project had got these accolades, and I was getting, to the top levels of journalism, international journalism. But then I got an email from a professor at Wits University in Johannesburg. And she basically, and I was expecting her to say something like, "Good job, you're helping the cause, you're bringing attention to the plight of poor people in South Africa." She said, "You're really doing a disservice to the cause of race relations, informality, urban planning." And I said, what do you mean? Like, this project is only done out of sort of like this desire to shine some sort of light on the problems in the hope that people will solve them and we can have a conversation around. And she said, the city of Johannesburg, and more broadly, the country of South Africa. And by the way, this isn't just a South African thing. The same story was told to me in Kenya, India, Brazil. Really sees this as bad PR, to be perfectly honest. To have these slums in the middle of the city, to have them right next to these nice neighborhoods, and your photographs are kind of highlighting the bad PR. And the solution for bad PR is to move the slum, is to actually remove the people and put them somewhere else in the guise of upgrading. So they may build some relatively low quality tower blocks, or they may wholesale replicate the community somewhere else in a variety of different ways. Or they may just come in with this sort of clearing semi-police outfit and run the people out at the point of a gun, right? They've done all three in South Africa. I'm sure they've done all three India and various other places that you're aware of. And she said, this is systemic. This is not taking care of the problem. It's just making it go away from the public eye. And the fact that you're highlighting this on the cover of Time magazine is just kind of reinforcing how the speed at which they want to start doing this or continue to do this. And the actual nuanced conversation about how to integrate people once they're already in a location into the surrounding community with transport links and all the other forms of making an informal area formal. That's really where my work is and where I hope that you could help support. Now, this put me in kind of a difficult place in a way as a photographer because I'm not qualified to offer solutions. And I think it's funny because if you talk with a war photographer, very often you present your work as a photojournalist and then people applaud you for being in harm's way and then you go on your way. I've almost never heard an interview where someone goes, well, how would you end the war? Like, what's your opinion? You know? It's almost like as a photographer who's focusing on these social issues from the air, I have some knowledge about it that I can then impart that's more valuable than like the people who are working in these fields for years and have doctorates and politicians who have been working in these communities for years. And so I'm not trying to say that it's unfair, but what I'm trying to say is I don't have the solutions, but for sure, I'm in a position, a very unique position to sort of point out what it looks like from above and try to provoke this systemic conversation, not the chronic, or I should say the acute problem in a particular city. But now that I've been to 37 cities, sorry, 38, because I just went to Lusaka, in 17 countries, and all the photos look similar, I think now I can really point out that this is a systemic issue.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was interesting to say, that you said when I asked you about the stories of transformation, you also shared the kind of like pushback or the additional complexity of transformation that was revealed, like who has the most information or who knows the best pathways towards equality. Okay. So, just maybe taking a broader perspective of art, as you were sharing about, you bringing light onto a certain issue. What would you say are the responsibilities of artists or a visual artist in these times especially?
Yeah, there's a difference between an artist's responsibility and a journalist's responsibility. And this project sits right on the border between them. But I've started to see more and more that this is a project, an art project of sort of my personal view on inequality rather than what I started off calling it, which was an objective view on inequality. And there was a guy who contacted me from the Nelson Mandela Foundation early on, 2016. His name was Vern. And I said to him, this is my objective view on inequality in South Africa. And he said, you have to stop saying that. The project is so much more powerful if you say this is your vision of inequality and your direction of the way that the project needs to flow. It allows people to get behind you. It allows you to lead in a way. And I think art, speaking truth to power, obviously is a fundamental position for journalists and artists. But I think also creating a vision and a voice where people can feel that they're being led, that you understand from the position of someone who's thought through these sorts of issues, what your position is, what the dynamic is of the project. And I would never want to like circumscribe what artists should focus on, because I think that there has been, let's say, inadvertent, profound art, even amongst artists who have focused on topics that were controversial and maybe even seemed impossible at particular times in history. And then later on, we've realized that actually their view and their leadership on bringing this to the public consumption was actually really beneficial. And I don't see myself as, I don't think this is actually that controversial of an issue, but I do see that like for other artists who are interested in creating a project, following your true vision and then figuring out the messaging after your art has come out is really important. And so to me, following my vision initially was really scary. That's what I'm trying to say. I tried to divorce myself slightly from the project initially. And I tried to make it more like Google Maps. And it was really that conversation with this guy, Vern, from the Nelson Mandela Foundation that made me realize I really needed to put my voice more into the project. And it's less journalism, in my opinion, because of that, and more art.
What kind of new approaches are you taking or imagining? And would you continue this work on inequalities? with these new approaches?
Yeah, so one thing I'm really excited about is working with a variety of researchers, a lot of them neuroscientists and brain health researchers, to provide evidence to them that the exposome, the environmental effects in some of these areas that I'm taking photos of, polluted areas, economic disadvantaged areas, areas without green space, without access to fresh water, all of that adds up to a negative exposome in the sense of how it affects brain health. And so these researchers that I'm working with have specifically started to do fMRI studies with residents in particular areas in some of my photo locations and other places that look similar to provide evidence that shows that these environmental exposures actually create higher incidences of an aged brain. And they've done that showing that in the counterpoint to people who are of similar age but have grown up in more equal situations, their brains are actually older. So it's this brain age gap that they're starting to prove. In the photographs that I'm taking, that have already taken, my process of research of where I'm looking at these locations is actually like factoring into how their research is undertaken and then presenting it to a wider audience afterwards. And we've developed a really cool tool now that I'm calling Unequal World that tries to bring all that together into a globe, kind of like Google Earth, where you can see the brain age gap all around the world in different countries and different cities. And you can see the indicators that exactly go into why the brain age is higher or lower in a particular location. And the idea is to eventually turn this into something that is kind of like a resource for any type of inequality study, data visualization. But then crucially, I think, has the storytelling component to it. My images being the baseline of a lot of these cities and a lot of these locations, but then also the communities of the people that I've flown over, but also talked to the people on the ground and some of the research that they've done in terms of neuroscience, those people. How can we have a conversation, feed their stories back into this tool and actually create some new data? Because one thing I've really realized is that coming in with a top-down understanding of a very complex social environment, let's say Dharavi in Mumbai, in India, people have been trying to do this for a long, long time. They've been trying to come in and say, okay, what we need to do is sanitize. What we need to do is make streets that are at 90-degree angles to each other. What we need to do is put in metro stops in these locations or fresh water in these locations. And without community involvement, every single time there's issues. I think that's similar across the world and it should be common sense, but people still keep trying to do it. I think because oftentimes people feel like cities are like a game or like a pattern that just needs to be replicated. And you saw that in the beginning of the 20th century when we started to build things like the garden cities or like the gridded cities in Western Europe and North America, where that may have worked, but in and in going into the 2050s, where we have cities, for example, in Africa and Asia that have already got to the point of being so interconnected and using technologies that are available to us now, we can kind of leapfrog all of that and start to make cities that are really diverse, really interesting, but not what you would expect from the city grid that you would have seen 50 or 60 years ago.
What would your advice be to younger artists who want to work or wish to work with social topics like inequalities, social justice, environmentalism? Do you have to say to them? I think you kind of covered that in your past answer about art and responsibility, but I'm curious if you have something you would like to share.
Well, I think I could give you the typical answer about following what's important to you and creating projects that are personally meaningful. But I think that other people can say that better. The one thing that I've learned really well is once you decide on a project, it's a very crowded information landscape right now. I think there's some key tools to get people to listen and pay attention to your project to actually have a chance at making impact. If you're the kind of artist who's interested in impact in your work, then I think that it's really important to create a project that has bounds to it. That's something that I've learned. And so when people ask me this, I usually say it's really important for me to have a bounded idea of what a project looks like. For mine, that's aerial photography looking straight down with a border visible in the image. If it doesn't have that, it's not an unequal scenes image. And I've tried over the last 10 years of this project to incorporate other elements, portraits, looking out of the edge of the airplane, photographs that just have shacks or something not having the border. And they just don't seem like unequal scenes images. And right now, what I'm doing in Berlin, is talking with a book publisher about publishing a book of this work. And it's a really interesting process of sequencing images and choosing images and what constitutes unequal scenes, what constitutes the project. And I don't think this should be dismissed as a photographer or as an artist, as something that is kind of a programmatic issues that come later after the project is done. I think it's really important to think of these things early, because of the fact that once you understand your project really well, once you put bounds around it, other people can see that vision and they can follow that vision. And they know that other photographs that you've taken and other photographs that other people have taken are not part of that vision. And it allows you to kind of very focused, in a very focused way, specify what your platform is in terms of impacts that you wish that this would have, and clarify your message and your vision in such a way that I see chasing fame or chasing likes or making your vision too broad really diluting that. And unfortunately, there's a lot of really talented people who have done really interesting projects that I think will get caught up in this idea of diluting the vision. And that might mean they've got so many amazing photographs, they can't choose which ones go into the final cut, and they need to be more rigorous in their selection. Or it might mean that they're exporting out the images and presenting them in showcases that don't match the vision of their project initially either. And that goes into this whole idea of curation and the life beyond when you take the photograph. But I think that's actually crucial. That's something that comes afterward, yes, but it's also something that should be envisioned before you even go out the door to take your first photo. But yes, I do want to reinforce the point that I think that socially aware photography and photography with the idea that it could actually impact behavior, change political views, or have some sort of desire to sort of see a different sort of a world. I suppose that's kind of like activist art or artivism, is very close to my heart. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing instead of another form of photography. And I started as a political scientist and an anthropologist. That was my studies in university. It wasn't photography. It wasn't the idea of making a beautiful image just for the sake of aesthetics. It was always marrying the idea of image making to issue revealing. And so when I am working with this new project on Equal World, and we're building this tool and hopefully going to augmented reality and extended realities with this tool as well, I'm really excited that the new versions of technology that are available, AI, virtual reality goggles, augmented reality glasses, all this kind of stuff can help tell that story better for the impact, for the purposes of impact. And I'm sort of technologically agnostic in that sense. In a way that, again, some photographers really believe that the tool is super important and that you have to use a particular camera or you have to do it in a particular style. That to me has always been really sort of secondary to how I do my work, which is really getting across a clear point of view that's relevant to people with a clear sort of activism back end, that they can follow the story that I've told them and then take that to some sort of behavior changing event, whether that's voting or whether that's donating or whether that's just getting more information.
So Johnny, coming to the end of our conversation, my question that I wish to ask you and a lot more of others is, what would a more equal world look like for you and feel like for you?
I think a more equal world would look, well, let me think about that. That's a great question. I really believe in the principles of the Enlightenment, and more broadly speaking, the sort of idea that citizens should have the right to sort of choose their own path through life, to express themselves the way that they want to, and to live a life free of persecution, but also live a life empowered, to live a life of idleness if they want to, academics if they want to, of business if they want to. I'm a very big proponent of freedom, of choice, of expression, religion, all these sorts of things. And so I think a more equal world is a world where those principles and those ideas are more closely embodied in the constitutions and the governing systems of places worldwide. And the trend right now is directly the opposite, in the hope that it empowers people to think more clearly for themselves and to enable them to live the lives that they want to lead, not the ones that their parents led or that a politician says that they should lead, or the country feels like it desires in order to develop in some way. So to me, equality, of course, in an economic sense is important. I think that it's really unfair. And I think we're moving more we're speeding into a trap where productivity is going to quickly be replaced. There's going to be a lot of idleness that takes place in the world, which in one hand is a good thing to be able to pursue your freedoms and your dreams. I just don't think that that's the way things are going. I think that that has been sold to us in a different way. So equality, to me, to pursue your desires, to pursue your dreams, has to come side by side and hand in hand with an economic framework that empowers that doesn't exploit the worker, that doesn't replace the worker with automated systems, and crucially, doesn't make the transaction of goods and services controlled either, so that you're censored or your spend of money or income is restricted in some way, which we're seeing more and more as well. So that's a complicated answer, but I think it's a complicated question as well. And I just am really in awe of all the people that I know who work on the ground, quite literally on the ground. And I'm flying here with a drone quite literally above people, but the people on the ground, my friends who are activists, lawyers, environmental activists and proponents and business people, politicians, people, community organizers, friends, people who are on the ground really trying to change things. I mean, I have great respect for those people. And yeah, we should be doing everything in our power to support people working on the ground and then also people communicating it from above.